So, Nisi, thank you so much for joining us on this episode of the People Success Circle.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to get some information out about mental health at work.
It's such an important topic, and I'm really glad that you took the time to be with us today because I feel like it's something that leaders everywhere are wondering. And I know this episode is going to help answer some questions. So, let's start out with I would love it if you can start out with a bit about your background and what led you to focus on mental health in the workplace.
Yeah, absolutely. So I've been a nurse for almost 20 years now, and I actually started off more in emergency management, and then I kind of shifted a little bit into public health. But the common denominator was everyone's mental health and well-being. If they were not okay mentally, they were not compliant patients, so they weren't taking their medication or things of that nature. And that's when I kind of realized that there's a huge gap in that space for people that are understanding it and recognizing those signs and symptoms early. And so that's what led me into being such a mental health advocate.
It's such important work, and I love being able to see the work that you're doing and learn from what you're doing personally as an HR leader. Workplace mental health has become a hot topic and a big challenge to companies over recent years. In your experience, what do you feel are some of the biggest challenges that companies and employees face with regards to mental well-being at work?
Yeah, I think that probably the first challenge is understanding the difference between a cultural change and kind of checking a box, right?
Okay.
I think sometimes we get initiatives put upon us at our places of employment, and we don't really have the means to culturally change that environment. And so it kind of feels difficult or challenging. Stigma around mental health. We all come from different backgrounds and experiences. And so people show up at work with their own, ideas of what mental health is or isn't. So do we talk about it? Does it make me seem like I'm not going to be a good employee? Does it make me feel like I'm weak? Those kind of biases that we might have. But when we're talking about as far as like in management, I think it's just lack of training, lack of proper training. I don't think that you can learn what you need to learn from, slides and a
Yeah.
deck for like mandatory training. That doesn't work in this space. And then I think there's a big disconnect between truly understanding belonging as a culture and how it relates to mental health. When people don't feel like they belong, their mental health absolutely suffers and their work production goes down. And then I think privacy and management of responding to situations, right? Like I don't want to be
Yes.
everybody's business, but if a team member of mine is going through something, at what point do I say something as a peer, and at what point do I say something as the manager or the supervisor? So I think
Yeah.
those are kind of the hot spots of why it's such a challenge, because all the complexities are often put on one level of people to manage and figure out, and that's not what they do for their job.
Right, right. Absolutely. I don't think most people who go into management and leadership really think about the mental health well-being of their employees first. I think that they care and they want to be strong leaders, but I think this like line of where do I where do I get involved and where do I not get involved? But I love that you were talking about how it starts with them belonging,
Yeah.
because that is such a profound thing that all leaders can focus on.
Absolutely. And belonging doesn't take, special training. Belonging just takes the opportunity to pause and be empathetic to the people that you work with.
Yeah, and empathy it is an important first step. So I want to ask you that question a little bit differently. What do you think the biggest challenge that employees are currently facing with regards to mental health at work?
I think employees are showing up already exhausted from their personal lives. For some folks, work, even though it was work, it used to be a little bit of an escape, I could come and I could put on this hat of this particular version of me that was maybe different from home and family life, so maybe be really productive and or maybe a little bit more assertive or things like that. But because they're just exhausted from their everyday world and all the things that are happening, employees are coming in almost defeated. Uh, And if there's not a culture of acceptance or understanding, they don't feel like they can just be themselves. So they come in, masking is what we call it, versions of themselves that aren't the best version that they would probably want. And it shows up in production all the time.
Employee engagement is key, and it's at an all-time low in the world right now. It's and in the US. So it's really is affected so much by the pressures that employees are going through in their personal life and their home life or in their work life. So what are some early warning signs that employees or leaders should watch for when it comes to declining mental health or workplace burnout?
Yeah. So there's three areas that we always tell people to focus on. So you have early signs and symptoms, and that looks like distraction, right? I
Okay.
can still get my work done. I can still take care of my responsibilities, but maybe I'm a little bit later than usual, or maybe I'm just on time where I used to be super early, or maybe the quality of my work isn't quite as well, but I'm still getting it done. It's still not bad. So they're distracted. So the example that we always use is think about the last time you had an early morning argument with someone, like a partner or best friend or kid. And then the rest of the day, you kind of spent marinating in that conversation. You can
Yeah.
still get your work done. You can still show up and be available, but it just kind of sits there and you kind of go back and forth to it throughout the day. The second stage is what we call worsening signs and symptoms. And this is where you see a lot of disruption. For
Okay.
managers, you will see what we call presenteeism. So presenteeism is where I show up, but I'm not here. I'm checking the box. I'm doing the bare minimum. I'm doing just enough to say, keep you off my back and have no problems. And this is typically where most managers start to see a change or recognize, because in that disruption phase, it's not just disruptive to the person that's having that challenge, it also becomes disruptive to the other people. So if you're late on your report, now I'm late on my report kind of thing. So the disruption goes
Yes.
both ways. And then the final stage is what we call crisis. And this is when someone needs immediate support, immediate resources to help them, even to the point where you may have to pull in, local law enforcement or local mental health authority to come in and take care of this person. So the signs and symptoms that we always say is look for a shift in someone's behavior. Look for what's not typical in how they do things. So if
Okay.
they're early, starters and they're coming in later and later, that's a sign that something is happening. Or if they're not coming in at all, so absenteeism, right? Just have the conversation. Don't assume. I might be absent or late because a change in my personal life, but I'm okay. Sometimes the physical symptoms, if you have a coworker that's all of a sudden complaining of headaches or digestive issues or not getting enough sleep, whereas before they never complained about those things, that could be a sign, because our mental health does kind of move into our physical health if
For
it's not
sure.
taken care of.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, so those are like the big things, especially if you're looking for burnout or that somebody might be challenged with something that they're going through.
Those are very clear, and I think that is really helpful. At what point should a leader initiate conversation when they start to see the signs?
Yeah, so I have to say, I think the biggest thing that we can do is operate from the space of prevention
Okay.
and what we call soft advocacy. So before an employee even starts, you want to have information about awareness, resources, posted everywhere, email signatures, break rooms, all of those spaces and things are great ways for you to create that culture coming in, right? So you already know that this is that space. I always say if an employee has to look up the resource, then you're not doing a good job in prevention. They should automatically know where it's at. So posters, digital, anything like that is a great way. If it's in that worsening, then you start to get into, a balance between peers at work, looking out for each other, and the hierarchy. So if it's your team member and you're the manager, you need to have policy created around what happens next, right?
Okay.
So if somebody's not doing, if they're not performing, most of us have heard of a PIP, they're going to get written up like that.
Yes.
What we encourage is, instead of doing that as the first step, we encourage an advocacy program. And this is just where you are taking the time to kind of knock out any other things that could be happening because it shows up in performance, right? How are things at home? What other things are you missing or needing for success? We have a lot of folks that are neurospicy in the workplace, and We want to make sure we're accommodating them so that they have their success. So I always say prevention, then advocacy, then policy and procedure. That policy and procedure is something that saves everyone. It just says that we did all the things that we could do within reason to make sure that this person was okay before we're punitive, because the result of a mental health challenge is oftentimes loss of job. And we all know it's super hard to fire someone. It's super hard to hire someone. Wouldn't it be great if we could prevent all of that and build that kind of roadmap instead?
What is it? I love that you talked about the policy piece too, of just making sure that we've covered our bases before we go to discipline. Because as an HR leader, I ask a lot of questions before we go to discipline. However, I think that the policy piece is something that companies might not even think of doing. So walk me through what that would look like if a company wanted to update their employee manual and talk about the policy regarding this. What would it look like?
Sure, absolutely. So we have like cultural assessments that I think first thing, like where are you at? Do your employees trust HR? Do your employees trust management, right? Or do they already feel like there'll be punitive action if there's any, hiccup in how I work? So that's the first step, assessing like where you are. Once you get the assessment, don't make excuses. Right?
Okay, yeah.
A lot of times we do an assessment and we say, oh, well, of course that department would say that because for whatever. Don't make excuses at that point. And then the second part, after you've got a good assessment in there, is to really, we say build it in stages. The prevention part, what are we doing beforehand? The advocacy part, how do we engage? So the advocacy part of your policy could include something like, let's update your emergency contact. Not just who it is, but when do we contact this person? So for example, if there's a medical emergency, that's who we usually put down for our emergency contact. But if somebody's dealing with a mental health challenge and the pain point is the partner, we want that to be the same person. So now we're talking to this person like, we want the best for you. What does that look like in advocacy? So creating that advocacy model, with some features like that, the emergency contact person, or how do you work best? How do you respond? Some of us take a minute with internal processing, and some of us are like straight up executioners, and we can just like get stuff done, no feelings attached.
Right.
Part of your advocacy policy. And then when you go into, kind of in your PIP or disciplinary, space, always do it with a lens of inclusion to what that person might be going through. Take whatever your current, discipline policy is, and then ask yourself, are we being thoughtful that they might be experiencing something out of our hands and their hands? What boundaries can we create or set within this punitive space? Because the truth is, you are hired to do a job, and part of well-being is being able to do that job.
Right.
But do we want to punish our employee because for this moment they are not well? Or do we want to look through a different lens? And sometimes it comes up just as like everyday conversations. Sometimes things we hear are things like, she should be fine. Her husband died 5 years ago.
Gosh, yeah.
Right. And not being empathetic and things like that. When you're on folks and you're asking about what does success in the workplace look like for you, it should include that mental well-being space. A lot of us are working in cubbies or at home. Do you work well at home? You might want to or need to for your circumstances, but do you feel disconnected? And what are some things that we can keep track of? This gives that manager or supervisor a really beautiful portfolio of how to best serve their team, as opposed to you didn't check this box for the third time, and now I have to write you up because our policy is flat.
Yeah. And I think so much relates to just the person's style and just in their strengths, and knowing that just having that open conversation can really clear the air and get the relationship on the right track so that someone can bring up a mental health situation if they feel like they need to. I had not heard the piece about emergency contact in the way that you just said that. And that is so true and so enlightening. So I appreciate you saying that. So many workplaces offer employee assistance programs or EAPs and different wellness initiatives, but engagement is often low in those programs. So what are some ways that companies can encourage employees to actually use these resources or On the flip side, are there better resources that companies should be considering?
Yeah, so I think that as far as engagement into that EAP component, most of the time the managers and HR, they've never used it, so they don't know what it's
Mm-hmm.
like. And so the first thing I would say is use the tools that you want others to use. Know what it's like for them, know
Mm-hmm.
what privacy they have, know what rights they have,
Mm-hmm.
and let them know, this information is protected. We don't know, XYZ. This information is not protected, and this is
Mm-hmm.
because I think a lot of people don't use it because they're like, who's going to know about this? How will
Right.
people know? And
For sure.
especially when you're talking about, very specific types of work. So I think like law enforcement,
Mm-hmm.
law enforcement doesn't want to use a resource that was given to them by their employer because where's the barrier of privacy?
Right.
At what point is that, resource going to be a mandatory reporter in what I'm going through, what I'm experiencing?
Mm-hmm.
So that would be my first thing is know your resources that you're going to use and know how they work and what's separated. And it's not a one and done. So you're
Right.
not saying one time, oh, you have this resource, or it's not something that is blindly left in a break room or lunchroom.
Mm-hmm.
Remind people all the time, your EAP representative should be giving you information on ways to be connected and resources and things like that. My second thought is really knowing your local resources. You
Okay.
can start with your local mental health authority. So
Okay.
the way this design is set up is every corner of our country is covered by a local mental health authority. It is a local quasi-government space where they receive some regional, state, and federal funding
Mm-hmm.
to really support the big bulk of the need of mental health in that county or region. Within each of those, there's so many resources: in person, telehealth, sometimes it's texting, things like that. Tap into those. Most local mental health authorities will have what we call an external relations or community liaison, or someone that can tell them about the resources they can tap into, because not
Mm-hmm.
all websites are up to date, right?
Right. Right.
They're often connected to various networks. So the local mental health authority is often connected to the primary hospital in that community. And so they're going to be that hub of information for you.
Mm-hmm.
So that's where I would go. And again, it's not a one and done. You don't just mention it, once a month or occasionally or onboarding.
Right, right. Oh my gosh. As an HR consultant, it's something that I talk to companies about all the time because you can't just expect someone to sign off on the handbook their first day in the job and remember this really important resource. In fact, at the last company I work with, we actually created business cards with the information on it so that people could keep the EAP information in their wallet and have it just readily accessible. And then even another idea would be to take a picture of your card and have it on your phone so that at any point in time you have this resource 24/7. So I could not agree more. It's not something you can talk about once and expect that your employees understand it and will utilize it. And there's a lot of things that EAP can do even beyond mental health that people don't realize.
So with your EAP, a lot of times the mental health challenge that someone is experiencing is situational.
Mhm.
So if they are experiencing financial hardships, that's one of the big promoters of experiencing a mental health challenge. And so if we can figure out, and this is through conversation, this is why I say before we become punitive, let's be advocates for them. What's
Yes.
happening? I might not want to tell my boss that financially I'm not in a good place or whatever that looks like. But if you created this trauma-informed space, this safe space, then it's not so bad. It's not
Hmm.
so challenging. And I think that then you can say, oh, you can use your EAP for more than that, letting them know. But again, I think that is, part of the design of just being in touch really with your employees and not just their performance.
Absolutely. So, how can leaders create an environment where employees feel comfortable discussing either their mental health or something just serious in their life without fear of stigma or without professional consequences?
Yeah, absolutely. So we always say model vulnerability. You be human. It's simple things, it's healthy boundaries. So if you guys are, working on a project or a deadline or whatever the case may be, modeling a time boundary. When somebody sends you an email after hours, thank you so much for sending this. Work-life balance. I'll look at it in the morning, kind of thing. So you can acknowledge and say, hey, just like I want my work, I want you to have it too.
Mm-hmm.
Modeling that vulnerability is good. The other thing is if employees know that they will not be discriminated against because of their mental health, which is the number one reason people don't talk about it at work, is fear of discrimination. And you do that by setting up what your policies are and you make them available. That gives your team members more confidence. It gives managers more confidence to help their team. It gives team members more confidence to speak to their managers because they know they're not going to get, penalized for having
Mm-hmm.
a rough time. And then training. We provide mental health first aid training, which is a very inclusive, method. We teach you a method to communicate with someone when you see the signs and symptoms. It's a national training. It's extremely powerful. It's a one-day training, but man, the resources that you can use will last a lifetime. And they're not just for at work. You can use them, wherever. And then don't be the only person of support. So when, your team members, your managers should know that there's other people, places, resources that they can tap into that can be a place of resource for them. And just being really public about those
Mm-hmm.
things.
Mm-hmm.
That's how you really create a safe environment. That's how you let people know, I'm going to have healthy boundaries. I want you to have healthy boundaries. I'm not going to be punitive if you're
Mm-hmm.
dealing with a challenge. We're going to figure this out together as a team.
Mm-hmm. I love that. It's so important. So one of the things that I get asked a lot by companies is how often should we update our employee manual? And most have a very outdated employee manual. So this sounds like something that we should include in any updates is a section on how we will handle employees that have mental health challenges at work. When I'm working with a company on updating an employee manual, are there examples of policies out there that speak to the advice you're giving?
Yes, there are. And let's just be honest, you can use AI to get you kind of
Mm,
started if you don't have the bandwidth for those smaller companies or organizations. My suggestion is this, get a template, get some resources, get one from another organization or a company. When we do our trainings, we have a holistic leadership academy, and it
mm-hmm,
includes creating templates and things of that nature. Get it done to the best of your ability. Bring in HR, bring in your legal team, also bring in your marketing team, because sometimes things happen to our employees and we want good PR on how to handle that. And
mm-hmm,
you want to make sure that those three departments and sometimes finance are really caught up to speed on what that policy is and looks like. So we say, make it part of your everyday routine, this policy. This policy is almost like a dashboard that you're going to look at multiple times throughout the month. Has
mm-hmm,
anything happened? Has anything come up? So if you have like a manager's meeting, just say, do we have any mental health challenges that we need to be mindful of or take care of? And that leads to conversations about advocacy and supporting someone. When
mm-hmm.
we do our trainings, we often, say, if we have someone that was recently diagnosed with a physical condition, let's say breast cancer, what would your team be doing to take care of that person? And without a doubt, the attendees are like, oh, we would, send food and take up
Yes.
work and, fill in the blanks and carpool, pick up kids. Like they're all
Mm-hmm,
everything. And we say, okay, and if we have another employee that's experiencing an invisible health crisis, like a mental health challenge, how would we support them? And they start to just kind of duplicate what they say at the, for the first person. And then we
mm-hmm,
say to them, would the manager have even said anything?
mm-hmm.
And most
Right.
of the time, no, you wouldn't know. You would just know that person took some time off, right?
Mm-hmm,
And
mm-hmm,
so it starts with the design and how we communicate that,
mm-hmm.
and the
Yeah.
manager asking for resources to support their team and empathy for their team. And then what is the boundary that we need to create that says, okay, if they miss 5 days because of their mental health challenge, here's the support that we can provide. If they miss 15, here's our next steps.
Mm-hmm.
And then as a report out for the manager, she can say, I have two people on green, I have one person on yellow, I have one person on red. Is there anyone that has a bandwidth that can support my person on red?
Yeah.
Wouldn't that
Yeah.
be great? You know?
Right, right.
Yeah.
Such a good way to say it. And I love the idea of just asking in a leadership meeting, do we have any mental health challenges that we need to know about or consider. Just asking and even putting it on the agenda is a step in the right direction.
Totally agree. Totally agree.
So, for businesses who are just starting to think about mental health initiatives for their organization, what is the most impactful way for them to start?
We always suggest that your people do some mental health training. There's general training like mental health first aid, and there's more specific training. So sometimes organizations will call us if there's been a suicide amongst their employees, or if someone had to be emergency detained at work or something like that. But initially, there should be mandatory mental health awareness training. This training really creates boundaries. As an HR professional, you're not there to do counseling.
Right.
You're not there to
Right.
provide therapy. And
Right.
it kind of gives them the confidence to say, I can recognize the signs and symptoms, and I know what resources to provide for them, as opposed to them like, I'm not really sure what to do about this. What do you think? And then
Right.
having that, water cooler conversation about an employee's mental health. So definitely mental health awareness training. And then leadership training specifically on mental health. And that includes how do we create policies and procedures to be supportive. But, I do understand it's a business and work has to still get done. So what is the contingency plan in the meantime? A good assessment is always a great way to evaluate your culture. Nonprofit organizations, they do something called a feasibility study. And this is where usually a consultant comes in and says, where y'all at culturally? Where y'all at, externally? Like, who knows you, brand awareness,
Right.
what your donors look like, all that stuff. And they kind of spit out this number of saying, okay, I think within reason, you guys can raise $10 million. That is exactly what we do for organizations. We come in and we just do an assessment of their current environment to say, a lot of times people want to initiate a mental health or initiate corporate wellness or DEI or anything like that. And we always say we're always going to start with emergency or emotional intelligence first. Because then we're all on the same page to be just kind to each other.
Right.
And I think those are probably the really good starting points. Maybe a review, at least a review of your current policies and resources. Does it say anything about mental health or challenge?
Right.
I think we would have more sympathy for those that have physical challenges than we do for those invisible challenges.
In your experience, how does mental health impact productivity and retention at work?
Yeah, absolutely. So you see an increase in production almost immediately. When people feel good and people feel loved and know that they're fully supported, no matter what's happening to them, they're going to show up differently. They're going to be more loyal. They're going to go above and beyond and giving back and pouring into that place as opposed to just kind of checking a box, right? Presenteeism that we talked about. But you're also going to see some other things. There's proof that you'll see improved cognitive performance, right? When you're stressed and frustrated, you're so busy in just surviving the day that you're not creative in the work that you're in, and you'll start to see that. Another big bonus is you will see reduced healthcare costs. People will skip work if they're not feeling mentally well, but they will come to work if they have the flu, right?
Right.
That kind of thing. And so it creates this homeostasis where people are just in this more balanced space. This is why you hear things about people being stressed out and then they get sick. It's no coincidence, it's true.
For sure. Yeah.
And so, and then you create a stronger employer brand. You create an environment where people want to come and work for you. People ask me all the time, would you ever go work for somebody? I'm like, listen, unless it's Disney or HEB, probably not, because I understand the value of an employee brand. Work there, feel loved and taken care of and supported and looked after. There's a quote that says, the highest form of love is consideration. And when people feel like they've been considered, they show up differently, not just in their work life, but in all areas of their life. So that would kind of be, I guess, my marching orders is figure those things out for your staff.
Love that you were talking about employer brand. It's something that I talk about with the companies I work with on a regular basis, because when an employer has really thought about their employer brand and thought about the image, they can not only re-recruit current employees and make them want to stay. But word spreads when people think about what it would be like to work for their company, it spreads, and so it's a great tool for also recruiting new employees to the company and understanding just what people think of when they think of working at that place. And I think we can all think of in our head a place that we might not want to work just based on what we've heard, right? So let's change the narrative and make the narrative positive about the employer.
Absolutely. I totally agree. Totally agree for sure.
Yeah. And I honestly don't think that a lot of employers put much thought into employer brand. But when they do, the benefits are both financial and cultural.
Yeah. And that's why we say, bring in your legal team, bring in your marketing team, finance team, bring in and HR, bring them all together. Because
Yeah.
at some point, potentially, it's going to touch all of those areas. And if you guys are on the same page, if something should happen, you're all set. You're okay.
Yeah.
You know what the, contingency is, you know what your next steps are. If you have something happen to an employee, your marketing and PR people are all over it. They already know. So there's talking points that you build around these things. So yeah, definitely engaging everyone too.
Yeah, that cross-functional team is so important. And I'll be honest, I don't think it happens a lot in the companies that I've worked for before, but it is something that is highly recommended to make sure everyone's on the same page with both level of support and their role in the situation.
Totally agree.
Yeah, so there are many professionals right now in all industries and in all fields who are experiencing stress and anxiety at work. What are some strategies that employees can use to manage their mental well-being?
Yeah. So I think the first one is having self-care plans, and not just like I made it through the week and so I'm going to have a glass of wine or go shopping, right? Those are coping skills. Self-care is where you pour into yourself, and it doesn't have to be this big elaborate thing. A lot of us get to where we're going and we spend an extra 5 minutes listening to a song or, talking to a friend before we get out of the car. That's a self-care initiative, covering those self-care opportunities, rest, movement, nutrition, and social connection. If you can build something in all of those spaces, you will move into more of a state of well-being. Another one, setting boundaries. I think the biggest misconception is when we set up boundaries, we say things like, don't email me after 6. That's not really a boundary. The boundary is, I'm not going to check my emails after 6, right? Understanding what they are and how to set them. Also, mindfulness techniques, just breathing, good, solid, deep breaths at work, before a meeting, before a presentation. There's an actual study about the reason that people crave a cigarette when they start to get stressed out. It's not the addiction to the nicotine. It's the fact that they've taken a lot of good, long, deep breaths. Oh, I got to have a cigarette because of the nicotine. That's not it. They're doing really good breath work.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
And they're also pausing, right? They have to pause to take the cigarette. And so just that pause and the deep breath work, by maybe not being intentional, is a way to think about like mindfulness and meditation. So I actually had a guest on my podcast recently that Marcy Westcott, and she gave some great advice for mindfulness at work that I will link that episode in the show notes so people can listen to that too. It was super helpful. So Nisi, that I also help job seekers, and I teach them the job search skills they need to stand out in the process and get hired. And one of the things I talk about often with job seekers is that when people don't have the skills, and it's a life skill to find a job, they struggle both financially and their mental health struggles. So when I think about that, I can't miss asking you a question about job seekers with regards to mental health. So what are some ways that job seekers can protect their mental health during that process of unknown?
Yeah, I think the first thing that they can do is identify their coping skills, right? Because for most of us, our initial or historical personal coping skills are not the best. So whether that's eating or drinking or shopping or whatever that thing is, really identify, how do I respond when things are not going my way? Without that identification, you can spiral and not even know it, right? I think, it's not like it used to be where you could just apply for a job. I
Yeah.
think things have changed, and I think we need to change the norm. The expectation is you should get support to get employment. And that partnership of support is really beneficial because you're not feeling like I'm by myself.
Right.
Isolation is like the number one symbol for a mental health challenge. And so the opposite of that is social connection, even if it's a shared mission to get you employed. Now, I know that a lot of times that comes with, sometimes a financial responsibility to get you there. But a
Yeah.
lot of times what will happen is you'll realize that my poor coping mechanism is going shopping or going out to eat. Well, if I'm
Right.
not doing that, I can take those funds and hire someone to help support me, move into the next direction.
Right. Right. I'm actually launching a group career coaching program soon because I have seen so much benefit from that support and knowing that you're not alone and that other people are going through the same thing. And I look forward to seeing how that plays out over time. But it also makes it cheaper for people to work with me when I can do it in a group setting. So I'm very excited about that. And just the mental health piece is one of the biggest reasons why, is because I want people to not feel alone in the job search because it is challenging. It is not easy to find a job. And in the US, the amount of time it takes to find a job is 5 to 7 months. That's a long time to live in a world of uncertainty.
And we're
Yeah.
already in a world of uncertainty, that it is your right to be in an environment that is supportive of who you are as an
Mm,
individual and that you show up as enough. You're already worthy. The
mm,
production is not what makes you worthy. You
mm-hmm,
are already that. So you walk through the doors, you fill out the application from a state of worthiness,
mm.
not a state of lack.